Our next key question is, what were the arguments for and against votes for women? So I want to pause and think about, from the time, what the main arguments for and against votes for women would be. So what do you think the main arguments would be for votes for women? And then what do you think the main arguments against votes for women would be? Pause and consider both questions. So the votes for women movement became an important issue after 1900, which gained a lot of support. Women were still not allowed to vote or become an MP. So women's groups, often supported by men, were putting forward arguments both for and against votes for women, as it was very much a live and debated issue at this time. Now there are two main women's groups that you need to know about. So two main organisations campaigning for votes for women were the suffragists, or the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, or the NUWSS, and their more famous cousins, the suffragettes, the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU. Now these two groups had the same goal of trying to get women's suffrage, but very different methods, which we'll look at in a later video. So what were the arguments supporting votes for women? There are 6 main arguments we're going to focus on today. These include: the vote is a way of making society fairer in general. In other countries, women now had the vote. Women's roles in society had changed a great deal by 1900. The vote would improve men's moral and sexual behaviour. Women had shown themselves to be capable of voting. And lastly, women in a democracy should have the right to vote. So firstly, the idea that the vote is a way of making society fairer. They believed the vote would allow women to put pressure on Parliament to change unfair laws. As at the moment there are only men in Parliament, they only passed laws that suited men. With women voting and becoming MPs, they hoped laws would be passed about equal pay and equal rights in marriage, and all the issues that upset women, and often men, about the inequality in society could start to be addressed, but only if women were given the vote. Secondly, women's roles had changed. More and more women were now working, and not just the working class. More and more middle class and even upper class women were choosing to work. Women were also starting to go to university and take on better jobs, such as being doctors. Women were no longer relying on men. In 1888, Annie Besant led women matchmakers on strike for better pay and conditions. So women were starting to organise and protest against things without the involvement of men. In other countries, women had now got the vote. So Britain had fallen behind other similar countries, many of whom were former British colonies. For example, by 1914, many women in the USA, New Zealand and Australia had the vote, and British women felt they deserved the same. There was a view that the vote will improve men's moral and sexual behaviour. Women at the time thought that men were immoral, and getting the vote would mean they could force higher moral standards, the theory being that women were the protectors of high moral standards and could force the men to abide by them if they had the vote. Christabel Pankhurst from the WSPU felt that giving women the vote would solve issues like premarital sex, prostitution, and issues around sexually transmitted diseases, as women in Parliament would pass laws to deal with these areas. Women had shown themselves capable of voting. For a long time, many people had believed that men and women had separate spheres, or separate areas that concerned them. Men were suited to the public sphere of work and politics, whilst women were suited to the private sphere of babies and home life. However, this, as we've seen, was starting to be challenged by many people. Women had been allowed to vote in local elections since 1907, and many had taken on public roles, such as people like Christopher Pankhurst and Annie Besant, who were getting involved in the public sphere and showing that this idea of separate spheres was out of date. Lastly, there's this view that women in a democracy had a right to vote. More and more men have been given the vote in the 19th century, as Britain became more of a democratic society, and women felt that they should also be included in this democratic revolution. Many women felt they would be better suited to voting than some men. A highly educated woman might argue that she had more information and knowledge than an uneducated man. They also argued that Britain could not be truly seen as democratic whilst half the population could not vote. So now we'll move on to the arguments against votes for women from the time. First of all, women and men had separate spheres, an idea we talked about earlier. Secondly, women should have a role, but in local affairs, not national affairs. Thirdly, there was an idea that women were already represented by their husbands, and giving them the vote would effectively give their family 2 votes. There was also a feeling it was dangerous to change a system that works. Many men thought that women did not want the vote, and as women did not have a right, fight to defend their country, they did not have a right to vote. Now, as we discussed earlier, many people felt that women and men have separate spheres. Many people believed that the women were suited to the private sphere of life, of home and babies. As many women did not work, they felt they had little understanding of political issues or issues beyond the home. Many felt that these spheres were ordained by God and that family life would be destroyed if they get the vote. This was also supported by scientific theories of the time, which said that women were guided by their wombs and lacked logic, and so it was felt that giving them the vote would be dangerous, as things like during their menstrual cycle, they may be irrational and not to be able to vote appropriately. The second view was that women did have a role, but in local affairs. They should be active in society, but in local community areas where they had a better understanding. They should be working as poor law guardians and for charity, but these were just an extension of the domestic role and was different to the issues portrayed in the national elections. This really is an extension of the separate spheres argument, arguing that women should be involved, but in areas they understood, rather than the broader political climate. Another argument was that women are already represented by their husbands. Some argued that women didn't need their vote, as their husbands could vote for them. They were expected to have the same views as their husband, and by giving a woman a vote, there was a view that they would effectively just be giving 2 votes to her husband to use as he saw fit. A slightly different argument was that the system worked and it would be dangerous to change it. Some people feared that allowing women the vote would destabilise the British political system. Giving the women the vote may mean that the current parties got less support and other groups took power, and there was concern about what this would mean and who would be given the power in this situation, and certainly the major political parties were very worried by this. Another argument was that most women do not want the vote. Although the suffrage movement had some support, the majority of women were not involved, which many took to mean that women did not want the vote. They went as far as claiming the campaigning women were simply mad and that they should be ignored. The last argument was that women do not fight to defend their country and so should not have the vote. And this view is based on the idea that people earned the right to vote by being willing to fight for their country. As women couldn't join the army at this point, the theory goes they did not deserve the right to vote. A slightly side issue was they also worried that if women got the vote, they would stop Britain from fighting in wars, as many men felt that women were softer and would not allow Britain to defend its interests. So in summary, there are many arguments put forward at the time, both for and against votes for women. The arguments for women's votes included It was a way of making society fairer. In other countries, women had the vote. Women's roles had changed by this point. Women voting would improve men's behaviour. Women were capable of voting, and women had the right to vote in a democratic society. Arguments against votes for women included: women and men have separate spheres they operate in. Women's role was in local affairs. Women are represented by their husbands. It would be dangerous to change a system that works. Women do not actually want the vote, and that women do not fight to defend their country, and so do not have the right to vote. Make sure you've watched this video carefully and filled in your notes page with as much detail as you can about the arguments both for and against votes for women. Thank you very much.